Good evening everyone. I'm the storyteller and I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. The Butcher of Brightwell. The wind howled through the empty streets of Brightwell, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic, coppery, and wrong, the kind of smell that made your stomach twist and your skin prickle, even if you couldn't quite place it. It was the kind of night where the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, where the moon hung low and heavy in the sky, casting an eerie silver glow over the town. The kind of night where you didn't want to be outside, but here she was. Detective Clara Hayes stood in the middle of the alley, her breath visible in the cold air, her flashlight cutting through the darkness like a blade. The beam of light trembled slightly in her hand, though she would never admit it was from fear. She'd seen plenty of crime scenes in her career, too many, some might say, but this one was different. This one felt wrong. The body lay sprawled on the ground, limbs twisted at unnatural angles, the face frozen in a mask of pure terror. The victim, a man in his late 30s, though it was hard to tell with the way his features were contorted, had been gutted like a fish, his insides spilling out onto the cobblestones. Blood pooled around him, dark and sticky, soaking into the cracks between the stones. Clara swallowed hard, forcing down the bile that rose in her throat. Muttered Officer Tom Grady, stepping up beside her. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and solid, but even he looked pale under the harsh light of the flashlight. What the hell could do something like this? Clara didn't answer. She couldn't. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of the scene in front of her. The cuts were precise, surgical almost, but there was a brutality to them that spoke of something far from human. And then there were the symbols, crudely carved into the man's chest, deep enough to reach bone. They looked like something out of a nightmare, jagged and twisted, like a child's attempt at drawing a language they didn't understand. Get the coroner down here, Clara said finally, her voice steady despite the churning in her gut, and cordon off the area. I don't want anyone near this alley until we've gone over every inch of it. Grady nodded and moved off to make the call, leaving Clara alone with the body. She crouched down, careful not to touch anything, and studied the symbols more closely. They were familiar, though she couldn't quite place where she'd seen them before. Some kind of old folklore, maybe. Something from the town's history. Brightwell was a small place, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, but it had its secrets. Every town did. The sound of footsteps behind her made her straighten up, her hand instinctively going to the gun at her hip. She relaxed when she saw it was just Grady, but the look on his face made her tense all over again. We've got a problem, he said, his voice low. The coroner's on his way, but there's something you need to see. Clara followed him out of the alley and down the street, her boots crunching on the gravel. The town was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy, oppressive. Like the whole place was holding its breath. They stopped in front of an old, weathered building, its windows dark and its door slightly ajar. A sign above the door read, Brightwell Historical Society, in faded letters. What's this? Clara asked, frowning. You'll see, Grady said, pushing the door open and stepping inside. The air inside was musty, thick with the smell of old paper and dust. Clara's flashlight swept over rows of shelves, each one crammed with books, documents, and artifacts from the town's past. In the center of the room was a large table, and on that table was a book, an old, leather-bound tome that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. This was delivered to the station this morning, Grady said, gesturing to the book. No note, no return address, just this. Clara stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest. The cover of the book was worn, the leather cracked and peeling, but she could still make out the title etched into the surface, The History of Brightwell, Volume I. She flipped it open, the pages brittle and yellowed with age, and began to read. The first few pages were what you'd expect, a dry recounting of the town's founding, its early settlers, its growth over the years. But as she turned the pages, the tone began to shift. The writing became more frantic, more disjointed, as if the author had been trying to get something off their chest before it was too late. And then she saw it. A drawing, crude but unmistakable, of the same symbols that had been carved into the victim's chest. Beneath it was a single line of text, scrawled in a shaky hand, asterisk, he is not dead. He is waiting. Asterisk. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She flipped the page, and then the next, her eyes scanning the text as fast as she could. The story that unfolded was one of horror, of a man, a butcher, who had terrorized the town generations ago. A man who had been killed, or so everyone thought, but whose spirit had never truly left. A man who fed on fear, who grew stronger with every life he took. This is insane, Clara muttered, though a part of her wasn't so sure. The symbols, the brutality of the murder, it all fit too well. There's more, Grady said, his voice grim. He handed her a photograph, old and faded, but still clear enough to make out the details. It was a group of men, standing in front of a butcher shop, their faces stern and unsmiling. In the center of the group was a man who made Clara's blood run cold. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a face that seemed to be all angles and sharp edges. But it was his eyes that got to her, dark, empty, like two bottomless pits. That's him, Grady said, pointing to the man in the center. The Butcher of Brightwell. Clara stared at the photograph, her mind racing. If the butcher was real, if he had somehow survived, or worse, if he had never truly died, then they were dealing with something far beyond their understanding. Something that couldn't be stopped with bullets or handcuffs. We need to find out everything we can about him, she said, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at the edges of her mind. Every story, every rumor, every damn thing that's ever been written about him. If he's back, we need to know how to stop him. Grady nodded, but there was a look in his eyes that Clara didn't like. A look that said he wasn't sure they could. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Clara spent every waking moment poring over the book, cross-referencing it with other historical documents, interviewing the town's oldest residents. The more she learned, the more her unease grew. The butcher, his real name was Elias Hargrove, had been a legend in Brightwell for as long as anyone could remember. A man who had butchered not just animals, but people, during the town's early days. He had been caught, tried, and executed, but the stories didn't end there. Some said his spirit had never left, that he still walked the streets at night, looking for new victims. Others claimed he had made a deal with something dark and ancient, something that had allowed him to cheat death. Clara didn't believe in ghosts or demons, but the evidence was hard to ignore. The murders continued, each one more brutal than the last, each one accompanied by the same symbols carved into the victim's flesh. The town was in a panic, the streets empty even during the day, the air thick with fear. And fear, Clara was beginning to realize, was exactly what the butcher fed on. It was late one night, as she sat in her office surrounded by piles of documents, that she finally found what she was looking for. Buried in an old journal, written in a hand so shaky it was almost illegible, was an account of the butcher's execution. According to the writer, Elias Hargrove had not died on the gallows as everyone believed. Instead, he had been taken by a group of men who had made a pact with him, who had promised to keep him alive in exchange for his power. They had buried him in a secret location, deep in the woods outside of town, and had performed a ritual to bind his spirit to the earth. But the ritual had gone wrong, and the butcher had been trapped in a state between life and death, unable to fully die but unable to truly live. Clara's hands trembled as she read the final lines of the journal, asterisk, he is not dead. He is waiting, and when the fear is great enough, he will rise again. Asterisk, she knew what she had to do. The butcher's grave was out there, somewhere in the woods, and if she could find it, maybe she could put an end to this nightmare once and for all. But as she gathered her things and headed for the door, a part of her couldn't help but wonder if she was walking into a trap. If the butcher had been waiting for her all along. The woods were dark and silent, the trees looming like sentinels in the moonlight. Clara's flashlight cut through the darkness, but it felt feeble, like it was barely holding back the shadows. She followed the directions she had found in the journal, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The deeper she went, the heavier the air felt, like it was pressing down on her, suffocating her. And then she saw it, a clearing, bathed in an unnatural light, and in the center of it, a grave. The earth around it was disturbed, as if something had clawed its way out, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. Clara's stomach churned, but she forced herself to step closer, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The grave was empty. A sound behind her made her spin around, her heart leaping into her throat. The butcher stood there, his face twisted into a grotesque smile, his eyes dark and empty. He was taller than she had imagined, his presence overwhelming, like a force of nature. Clara's hand went to her gun, but she knew it was useless. Bullets couldn't kill what was already dead. You're too late, the butcher said, his voice a low, guttural growl. The fear has already done its work. I am whole again. Clara's mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but there was none. The butcher stepped closer, his smile widening, and she knew she was going to die. But as he reached for her, something inside her snapped. She wasn't going to go down without a fight. With a scream of pure rage, she lunged at him, her flashlight swinging in a wide arc. The butcher staggered back, surprised, and for a moment, she thought she might actually have a chance. But then he laughed, a sound that sent chills down her spine, and grabbed her by the throat, lifting her off the ground. You're brave, he said, his voice almost admiring. But bravery won't save you. Clara's vision blurred, her lungs burning for air. She clawed at his hand, but it was like trying to move a mountain. And then, just as she was about to lose consciousness, she remembered something she had read in the journal. A single line, almost an afterthought, asterisk, the butcher's power comes from fear. Without it, he is nothing. Asterisk, with the last of her strength, Clara forced herself to relax, to let go of the fear that had been consuming her. She looked the butcher in the eye, her gaze steady, and smiled. I'm not afraid of you, she whispered. For a moment, nothing happened. And then the butcher's grip loosened, his expression shifting from triumph to confusion. He dropped her, stumbling back, his form flickering like a bad signal. Clara hit the ground hard, gasping for air. But she didn't take her eyes off him. No, the butcher growled, his voice trembling. This is not possible. But it was. Without fear to sustain him, the butcher began to fade, his form dissolving into the air like smoke. Clara watched as he disappeared, the clearing falling silent once more. She lay there for a long time, her body aching, her mind reeling, before she finally forced herself to stand. The butcher was gone, but as she made her way back to town, the woods silent around her, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, waiting. And that one day, when the fear was great enough, he would rise again. The town of Brightwell returned to its peaceful ways, the murders stopping as suddenly as they had begun. The people went back to their lives, the memory of the butcher fading into legend once more. But Clara Hayes never forgot. She kept the journal, the photograph, the book, locked away in a drawer in her office. And every year, on the anniversary of that night in the woods, she would take them out and read them again, reminding herself of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of her quiet little town, because she knew, deep down, that the butcher was still out there, and that one day, he would come back, and when he did, she would be ready. The end.